Hello and a very warm welcome to you. There are 4 babies born every single second into a world that is struggling to cope with the demands placed upon it. Some people are so concerned they are refusing now to have children. This is Roundtable. Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. People, well, they decide against having children for all kinds of reasons, and now it seems more potential parents are taking that decision because of the state of the planet.
Many would-be parents worry about the environmental cost of bringing a baby into the world. In terms of carbon emissions, researchers in Sweden found it has a bigger impact than most other lifestyle changes. Having a child is equivalent to 58.6 tons of carbon each year on average. Compare that to driving a non-electric car at 2.4 tons, or eating meat at 0.8 tons of carbon dioxide. So many potential mums and dads say it's a moral obligation to have no kids, or at least limit the number as the world population continues to grow. By 2030, the UN estimates there will be around 8.5 billion people on the planet, and by 2100, there could be as many as 11 billion. Women in the UK who have joined a movement called BirthStriker say they will take action to not procreate until the world gets its act together on climate change. But is not having children an appropriate way to do your bit for the climate crisis?
Well, I'm very pleased to say that joining us on Roundtable today we have Talia Woodin, a BirthStriker and a member of Extinction Rebellion Youth. Diana Coole is with us too, Professor Emerita of Political and Social Theory at Birkbeck University here in London. And we're joined from Colorado Springs in the USA by Dave Gardner, Executive Director of World Population Balance, an organization with a mission to encourage just one child per family. Thank you all very much indeed. Dave, I'll come to you in just a moment, but Talia, I want to come to you. You're 20 years old. Mm-hmm. You are a BirthStriker. You have decided not to have children. And you say you decided that some time ago. Why?
So I was brought up in a family that was very, I guess, consumed with environmentalism and with activism. Both my parents were hugely involved in Green Party politics and in activism themselves. And so I was brought up very aware of climate change and other issues that we face as a species, and also very aware of the impact that the society that I have grown up in has on the rest of the world. And that was really scary, and something that caused me a lot of anxiety and a lot of real difficulty from a really young age. And that was 15 years ago, and we're now...
So hang on, you made this decision 15 years ago?
No, so 15 years ago when I first really started being aware of climate change.
So you were very young when that happened.
Yeah, it was a very big part of my life. And this idea of
not having children came to you when?
I don't really remember the specific time, what age I was, but for a while, I've never wanted to have children. It's never really something that I've thought would be part of my future. I think for me, like, I've always been very certain that I was going to go down a similar path as my parents and continue with that activism. And for me, the idea of bringing a new person into this world when I can't even do something to stop all the suffering of all the current children in this world, that just never sat right with me.
Could it possibly be that you are simply not maternal and that you are rather conveniently, because of your involvement with Extinction Rebellion Youth, marrying this, for want of a better word, to the idea of us destroying the planet?
I'm sure there's an element of both. I think I've always been uncomfortable with the expectation that because I am a woman, I would want to have children, just instinctively. I never have. My mum's always brought me up knowing that I don't need to have children if I don't want to, and that doesn't mean less of me. But I don't think that getting involved with BirthStrike and getting involved with Extinction Rebellion has changed that, because I think
You think it was already there?
Yeah, I think my activism was a big part of that. It's just given me more.
We'll find out more in just a moment. But Diana, let me ask you, I mean, you look at the way society moves and changes. What do you think is happening here? We're told that more and more people are joining this movement. It's only about 300 official BirthStrikers at the moment. So what's going on?
Well, it is quite a small movement. And I think there are two rather different things going on here. One is people who are looking, as Talia is, at the world and saying this is a really dangerous place. Do we really want to bring new beings into it? And there are the people who, as an act of good citizenship, are saying the world's overpopulated. Let's not contribute to that, especially in developed societies where a new child is going to consume more than its fair share of resources. So I think there's somewhat different arguments, but of course there are lots of good reasons for women not to have children, and the presupposition that every woman will have a child is something that feminists have been fighting against for a long time.
Let's draw a distinction here. I don't believe that the BirthStrike movement, from what I've read, Talia, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, is the anti-natalist movement. Because the anti-natalist movement says we are not going to have children because the world is such a terrible, terrible place. Whereas these groups of people are saying, look, we're not going to have children because we think it's right that we draw attention to what's going wrong with the world, and at the moment it is the wrong time to do so. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I wouldn't want to put a child through what we're being told future generations are going to live through in the coming decades.
But if the world got its act in order, that's fine.
I mean, if. We can talk about hypotheticals all day long, but that's an if. But I think the wider BirthStrike movement is much more using that as a tool in which to ring the alarm bells around the climate crisis, and for young people that actually are very often not given a say and not given any decision making on their own futures, to say, well, you know what, we're going to make this decision. This is a crisis and we're taking it as a crisis.
Dave, with you in just a moment. Bear with us if you would. So Diana, the BirthStrikers are not trying, they say, to solve the problem. They're just perhaps drawing attention to it. Is that what we're seeing?
Well, yes. I mean, for my generation, certainly we did have one or fewer children often, because as baby boomers, we were aware of an environmental crisis. And I know that the new generation is very distrustful of all the dialogue around population control and so on. But it seems to me that this is something we have to talk about.
But isn't this perhaps slightly self-indulgent because they can afford to do this?
Exactly.
In poorer parts of the world, you can't.
Yeah, exactly. And personally, I would argue that it's such a privilege to be able to decide not to have a child for a woman, that I think the really important thing is to campaign for women everywhere to have that choice and to have adequate reproductive health and family planning services, because we know that there are hundreds of millions of children, of women who would like to limit the number of children they have, and they simply don't have access to affordable contraception or abortion services. So that could make a huge environmental impact, but it also would really help to empower women. And that seems to me a really important.
Okay, well, we'll hammer that point home as well. But Dave, what does your group actually want to see happen?
World population balance, we are trying to celebrate and encourage informed decisions about family size. For too long, the world has set up this expectation that women are here to bear children, and lots of them. And I'm glad Talia's mother didn't, force that expectation on her, but she's grown up in a culture where that expectation exists. And so we're really trying to kind of counteract that, make sure that everyone around the world who is making a family size decision has access to good information about the fact that, yes, the world is overpopulated, and the decision you make will have a really profound impact on the quality of life of any children you bear, plus all of the children of the world. Okay,
so one child per family, so that's one for every two people, assuming that we're talking about the normal family grouping. So one for every two. So therefore, population is going to fall. If you followed that model all the way through, there wouldn't be anybody to look after you in your old age.
Well, that's certainly one little minor consideration. But first of all, we're not trying to dictate family size decision or dictate that one child should be the decision everyone makes. But we are pointing out that if we could get the world down to a one-child norm, if we were to average one child per family around the world for about 100 years, world population would be back down around 3 billion people. And the most serious scientific inquiry suggests that 2 to 3 billion people really is the magic number where we could live in sustainable balance with
You
Mother
see, I've had
Nature
this
here on Earth.
conversation before on this program, and it's always pointed out that you need more people because the world is growing economically as well. If your model was followed, economic growth would shrink, Dave.
Yes, and that would be a good thing. It is about time that we spoke up about that too. We cannot have perpetual economic growth on one finite planet. The truth is, the size of our economy and the size of our population, those are the two things that we have working against us today. We need to get over ourselves and try to have a sustainable balance between population and economy. And one last point about that, David. The economy is here to serve the people. It only needs to be as big as the population. It just needs to be big enough to meet our needs and no bigger.
Okay. Talia, you Extinction Rebellion youth, I mean, it's all part of this. Economic growth is just a bubble waiting to burst.
Yeah, and I have a lot of thoughts. And, you know, I just wanted to say I'm so appreciative to be here because I think actually a real issue around this debate is that all too often it's brought up in a really problematic way, or it's just avoided altogether because there are a lot of problems that surround it. So I think having a space to be able to discuss it is really important. I am aware that a lot of the time, not just with talking about population and not just talking about the decision whether or not to have children, we are still, when it comes to issues around the climate crisis, having conversations but only involving the same people each time. And I think that is a big problem. I think if you were to get a whole group of young women from loads of different places around the world into this room and to have this conversation, I think it would be very different than to have 3 individuals who are in an older generation and myself as the only young person.
Are you suggesting we're all part of the older generation?
I am, yes.
Well, we won't take it personally. I mean, we'll leave that up to the viewers to decide.
But the other thing that I wanted to say is that it's interesting talking about economic growth, and I really don't know the first thing about economics.
Well, okay, I don't know very much, but this is the straightforward fact. Fewer people, less economic growth. Wonderful in the end because Dave says the world population will balance that out, but getting there is painful. It means you and other generations to follow for a short period of time would not be able to enjoy the things that modern people do.
Yes, but this conversation is also going from the assumption that the current economic system is equally distributed, which we know isn't the case. I mean, Oxfam just produced a study, like in the last month or so, that showed that the richest 22 men in the world own more wealth than all the women in Africa. And for me, that screams that there should be a different conversation that we should be having rather than population. It's about looking at the existing population and who is in control of resources and why it is that those people have control of those resources, and therefore who has power and who has economic and social power, and therefore who is included in these conversations. And for me, the fact that we are having a discussion about population and economic growth, but
you're making a statement about the world per se and using population as a means to get that message across, fair?
In some ways, it's less about population. It's about, I think, having more control over young people, having more control over their futures, because we are given very little say in that.
Okay. Diana, you were nodding as Dave was talking in the same way that he was nodding as you were talking. What point did you want to make?
Well, obviously, per capita income can still be high with fewer people, but we need a different kind of growth. And we keep hearing that within a few decades, 40% of the population are going to lose their jobs anyway because of technology. So I think with small populations, with technology, we could have much more sustainable standards of living.
Okay, it would take more than 100 years for us to see a reverse if people did actually limit the number of people that they have in their families.
But what happens now is really crucial, because a lot of countries which have had very high fertility rates, now their fertility rates are falling, but the generation which is coming up and which is itself becoming fertile now, those are the people we have to reach. I've just come back from Ethiopia last week, has very high population growth. There are huge numbers of young people who are unemployed, and those are the people that need access to family planning so they can limit their numbers of children.
In fact, interestingly, it is Africa is going to be the one continent that continues to grow population-wise by the end of this century if current models are followed, whereas even Asia, which has seen a population explosion, will start to come down. Dave and everybody on this panel, let me pull up a chart. We won't see it, but I can explain it. It says, if you have a child, that child produces 60 metric tons of carbon dioxide, pollutants, into the atmosphere. If you live car-free, it's about 1 as opposed to 60. Switch to green heating, less than 1. Deep retrofit of the house, fly transatlantically, less than 1, getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. So it would appear that having a child is a massive pollutant. But this is the point I want to make, and I'll go to Dave on this one first. That child is going to be doing all of those things anyway. So those things make up part of the 60. It's one of those things that's sort of put out there just to make you feel bad about having children, perhaps, Dave.
Well, there's a lot of talk about climate change, about the system that we have that is causing the problems, and the behavior of these masses of people that's causing the carbon emissions. So you cannot leave out this big multiplier in the equation, the number of people that the system serves, or the number of people doing the behaving, unsustainable behavior in our case today, makes a huge difference.
Yeah, but that one person who's supposedly, according to this chart, producing 60 tons of carbon dioxide is making that up with the transatlantic flights, the non-electric car, the greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not the person that's doing it, it's the things they're doing.
Also, this
the things they're doing, yeah. But
Yeah, that's
you know
the whole
what?
point. It's
No, I understand that,
population
but
is
what
a
I'm saying is sometimes we're
multiplier
made
of
to
all the
feel
other things.
rotten about
We
being
can- we
a
can
person
only-
because
we-
we're responsible
But
for it,
also
but it's
this
actually the actions.
This is based on the assumption that every child born will consume and therefore have that same impact.
Well, you're bound to consume, aren't you? Otherwise you wouldn't live.
I'm not saying that we're bound to consume, but as I was just talking about, if you look at global wealth and resource distribution and the impact and the footprint of global populations, you'll see that there's a severe difference between the impact and the carbon footprint that a young person has in the UK or the US or anywhere else in the global north and a young person has in the global south. Okay. And so saying that every single child that is born has that same carbon footprint.
This is as it stands at the moment. Dave, I'm sorry I interrupted you. Carry on.
Yeah, and Talia makes a good point. I mean, our behavior does really make a difference, but we can only green up our lives so much. And the rich world, the richest couple of billion people on the planet, not to mention the 22 richest people, definitely have some work to do to skinny up our lives. But just, having food, shelter, transportation, water, they're basic needs that will always have a carbon footprint. And so the more progress that we make in living more sustainably and reducing our carbon footprint, that gets undone. Let's say we all shrink our carbon footprint by 50%, but then we ignore the population part of the equation and we double the world's population, then we haven't gained anything at all. And that's why sustainable population advocates are not suggesting that we only talk about the population part of this equation. There's nothing that's exclusive about this. We need to be working on economic equity around the world. We need to be working on getting over ourselves with this obsession with economic growth. And we need to be making sure that couples and young people around the world are making informed decisions about family size and have access, have the ability to exercise family.
But BirthStriker perhaps is, some might say, an overreaction because it means no people are going to be born.
Well, that'll average out, that'll make up for some families that decide to have 2 or 3 children. The truth is, we should celebrate that. I celebrate the BirthStrike movement, and I congratulate you and thank you. I'm sorry that we have a world where you feel like you have to make a decision that isn't maybe coming from your heart. In a perfect world, you might be deciding to have children, and I'd like to see us get back to that world.
I
It is
wonder,
going to take
Talia, if
more than 100 years.
people might be more convinced by your particular argument
Well,
if you were doing something that was against what you actually wanted to do. You're quite happy to do this anyway because you don't feel like you really want to have children. But if you really wanted to have children, you
I
said,
don't feel that I want to have children because I've been aware of the world that I've lived in as a child, as a young person, that I will live in as an adult, and the world that my children will live in from a very young age. And that has shaped my understanding of the world. If that world wasn't like that, maybe I would want to have children. And this is just me. It's
which
just
came
personally.
first, chicken and egg, I suppose.
Well, exactly.
in that
It's
sort of
really interesting though,
situation.
because I'm sat here and I'm aware that we're kind of all arguing for the same things, but I'm somehow feeling very defensive about it. And it's really interesting. And I think for me, it's the difference between being part of a movement made up of individuals that are saying, I am choosing not to have children, and being part of a movement that is trying to tell other people not to have children. And it's really interesting for...
Who's trying to tell other people not to have children?
Well, I mean, being part of an organisation that is trying to promote one child per family, it in some ways will involve telling certain people to have less children.
No,
and
we're not dictating that decision. We're trying to make sure you have the information to make your own decision without
sure,
pressure.
but it's with an underlying agenda, or at least an idea of how things should be.
I get this. I get that there are different areas from which you're both coming. But let me put this to you, Talia.
Yeah.
BirthStrike spokeswoman Alice Brown. Do you know Alice?
No.
Okay, well, she's part of the movement. She speaks on behalf of the movement.
Mm-hmm.
This is one interesting thing she said. It is sort of desperation. I don't know if I'll regret it one day. Now, the point she's saying is I'm making a statement here, but actually, one day I might want to have children. Do you ever consider that you might think when you're at a certain age, gosh, I wish I'd had children, and perhaps now it's not possible?
I mean, I have maternal instincts. I have kind of very basic human instincts in the fact that I see a baby and I think babies are wonderful. I was a childminder for 4 or 5 years. I think kids are wonderful. I enjoy spending time with children. I've been in relationships in the past where I've wondered what it would be like to have children with a partner. But for me, the fear around regretting having those children because of the world that I'm bringing them up in, and knowing that I can never fully keep them safe and never fully offer them all that I'd want to offer, that is more scary than regretting having children. And I also don't sign up to this idea that having your own biology, having your own blood relations as your children is somehow the be-all or end-all. I think that there are plenty of children that need us to be caring for them, whether that's as their parents or whether that's just in order to create a better world for us. And I would rather be doing that than procreating.
Okay, listen, please don't feel you need to feel defensive.
No, I'm not at all.
Nobody's attacking you. It's an open discussion. Diana, what do you think about the fact that life is about having children?
Well, I don't think life is about having children. I mean, it's an integral part of life for some people. And actually, I wouldn't counsel people not to have children. I would say, please don't have more than 2 children, because then you won't do more than reproduce yourself.
You see, when I had my first grandchild, I suddenly realised where I stood in the pecking order. Having once been down the bottom, I'd now moved to the top, and like a game of Jenga, pretty soon I was probably going to get knocked off. And that was the human race continuing itself. It's natural, isn't it?
A lot of things are said to be natural, like women's subordination and so on.
Oh, I've never said that. No.
No,
And
but
I don't think many people these days
I
would
think
dare
claiming
say
things are natural is always a bit of a dangerous way to proceed. But, I mean, lots of people do want children. And, of course, for many people, having a family is really important. And I think they should be able to do so. I just think it's a lifestyle choice to have more than 1 or 2 children. And in a precarious world running out of resources, it's an irresponsible choice. So
I'm going to have to go to Dave very quickly because
Okay.
we've got about 30 seconds left. Do you think this is all going to change anything?
I hope it will. And I am optimistic because the fact is now that young people like Talia are carefully considering their family size decision, and that's what we need more of.
Okay, but it's not going to happen tomorrow, is it?
No.
It's going to take some time. Listen, thank you very much indeed. Appreciate you coming in, Talia. Of course, if nobody has any children, there'll be nobody left to look after anybody.
Well, we know that's never going to happen.
Okay,
so.
listen, thank you. And Diana, thank you too for coming in. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much for tuning in. From Talia, from Diana, from Dave over there in Colorado Springs up in the Rocky Mountains. We appreciate, Dave, you taking the time to come on the program. And thank you very much to you for watching this edition of Roundtable. We hope to have your company next time. But for now, from me, David Foster, and the team, goodbye.